Hey everybody, and welcome back to Stand By for Adventure. This is John. It's late on Tuesday. Sorry about that. I had some stuff to do today, and so this got pushed later and later and later. But now I'm here, and I got something quick to talk about. Basically, one of the things that I really have, strangely, it's taken a long time to learn this. But one of the things that will make your games better, I don't care what kind of game it is taking advantage of your ability and your players' abilities to describe the world, what's happening in the world, what their characters are doing, to make it fit better with the genre of game you are playing. You could use, and again, I use D&D for a lot of this, but I could be talking about a superhero game. I could be talking about anything, right? The story structures are still the same. The play patterns are still basically the same. It's just the mechanics that change. But I do understand how mechanics can also reward or encourage certain sorts of behavior. So that's a given. Just assume that. But one of the things you can do in something like D&D, I'm currently running that Eberron game. I've mentioned it before, and I'm running it pretty straight Eberron, but it also has and whatever Eberron means to you. I mean, there've been books and books and books and books published about it. It's pulp fantasy, uh, mystery, post-war America or post-war Europe, even, uh, all combined, all mashed together, right? But it's set in this fantasy universe with magic. And when I talked to the players about it, I specifically pitched it as an Eberron game, which they are familiar with the setting, so they knew that. And I said, but I want it to be more of a thieves guild, and that not only set the tone for the characters for the players to come up with their characters, like the sorts of roles they wanted to fit, since they weren't, members of the court, or they weren't farmers coming in from, the folk hero background, something like that. And so they came up with appropriate characters, but then during the game, the descriptions of the places they live, the places they visit, the people they talk to, have all been very grungy and dirty. It's certainly sometimes I kind of gloss over things, but when I do describe them, it's two of the characters live in an old brewery that is now acting as a flop house for a whole bunch of people, and that's not very fantasy-ish, right? That's certainly not very high fantasy, even though they're very much in a high fantasy world. But the feeling of this game through the description becomes much dingier and a little more gritty and realistic. I could just as easily have them be in a thief guild sort of setup like they are, and they could still be in a very fantasy city. Like, I wouldn't bother with the grunginess and how disgusting the sewers really are, as opposed to fantasy sewers that are just slimy. Um, but that sort of thing, and I could change the entire world based on those descriptions. So that's something to keep in mind. This is tying in. It's kind of a spectrum of what I want to talk about here. So when you're running your game, think about how you want to present the world. Is it shiny and clean and beautiful and pure, and is it that sort of magic, like, or that sort of fantasy setting, almost like really shiny computer games that are, it's not bloody and gory and that sort of thing. They're just very almost anime fantasy sort of thing. Like, you could run D&D and narrate it as if it's a fantasy anime, and it would absolutely fit. You could have, your characters could have ridiculously large swords, and they could have funky armor, and if you have an artificer, it could be more like a whatever, a bioroid, or some. It could be anything, any sort of what's the apple seed. Like it could be your Warforged looks like one of those guys, and but it just anything you can do any of that, and it's just description. It doesn't change the mechanics of the world. It doesn't change anything else about the world other than how you are describing it and how the players interact with it. And that's really important because if the rules stay the same, you can adapt your game to almost any kind of setting or feeling for any sort of game. My buddies and I are huge fans of Warhammer Fantasy role playing, especially second edition that was printed by Green Ronin and then picked up by Fantasy Flight after now Asmodee, after that contract ended with Green Ronin. Second edition was fantastic. First edition was also very, very good. Just it's an early role playing game, so it had a lot of problems. And the Warhammer games were very, very gritty and realistic. Like even more so than like they were kind of dark. What is Warhammer's whole catchphrase is, right? The in the grim future, blah blah blah, whatever. And it's that sort of feeling. It's very medieval ages. Chaos infects everything, and that sort of stuff you can put into your D&D game, and it's great background stuff to pull on, and so that can inform more of what's going on in your world. But just because the standard D&D setting doesn't have stuff like that doesn't mean you can't make those sorts of big changes and introduce new races. You could introduce new types of monsters. There could be just an undead plague that is spreading across the land, and that's just what reality is right now for those players or for those characters and everybody who lives there. Replace the Black Plague with the Walking Dead plague, and you can still have that same sort of result of, yeah, my buddy died and then came back and killed his whole family, and hey, what do you know, after a while 70% of the population was dead, or whatever the number was for the Black Plague, and I really ought to know that. But you can do that sort of thing, like put those big sorts of changes into your world and let the players know about it so that they might want to tie into that story, and then you've got something for them to be interested in outside of whatever short-term adventures that they're doing as well. And then the final part of this is not only can you change your descriptions of the setting, you can change things about the setting in particular, like the addition of chaos, or you could have, wild magic or whatever. But then there's also changing the rules of the game, the base rules of the game, and specifically of character generation, to do something else. And sort of this is already included in the game when you get into feats and in some ways the special abilities underneath the subclasses, because all wizards have these abilities but only invokers have these abilities, and so that kind of changes how that character is going to operate, right? Like that's what game design is about. And then in addition to the racial abilities, the class abilities, and feats, feats are an additional thing that break the rules in some way or give you some advantage that other people who don't have that feat can't do. They just don't have access to that. You can do that at the character creation level too. You could give everybody, hey, I want to run a really high power game where you guys are effectively demigods, even if you don't take the Aasimar or Tiefling background. Tiefling, I say, just because it could be demonic or whatever. It would really be Aasimar. And you could say to them, like, write up your character, however, whatever you want to be. You want to be a halfling, you want to be a goblin, like whatever is allowed in your setting. and then say just add 2 to all your stats. And yeah, of one thing, your players are going to love it. It's going to up the difficulty of everything, obviously, for you as the GM to kind of balance against, but it's also going to, they're going to be aware of that, but they're going to have super competent characters that are really effective. You could give out additional feats. I have often in D&D games just had everybody start with one additional background feat that hopefully wasn't combat related, that was more like the keen mind or linguist or even luck would be fine with me, that sort of stuff. Just because it introduces more of those things into the game. There are more cool abilities for the players to use, and more ways for them to interact with the game, and more things for them to have to keep track of, sure, but hopefully it's something they want to keep track of because they got to make that choice. They got to pick an additional thing that most other people don't get. And certainly by the rules, nobody gets. But you can also, and that's what this document right here is showing, you can also create a whole list of things that players could potentially have depending on something, like they're from a certain region or they were alive at a certain time or whatever, born on a certain day, that sort of thing. Or it could be just everybody has this, and it's a fundamental change to the setting, but it is also a fundamental change to the characters themselves. Now, this document in particular that we're looking at here, and I know you probably can't read it too awful well, but this is a table going from 1 to 100 that lists wild magic trait or ability, and players could either roll on this list or choose one. This document, I don't even remember where I got it. I know it was online somewhere. I think it might be a Chris Perkins design doc from when he was running or planning to run a game years ago. I have no idea when I downloaded this. But on this list, it runs through, and sorry, up here, he had this something that happened in the setting, this Night of Wild Magic, I think is what it was called. But campaign rule he wrote up for this is, at first level, unless you decide otherwise, your character gains the Wild Magic feat. This feat is free and has no prerequisites other than your character must have been in Valorane, which is the setting for this, on the Night of Wild Magic. The Wild Magic feat grants you one of the special traits or abilities described below, your choice, or if you feel daring, you can roll randomly. Abilities that duplicate spells are cast at your level, but no two characters in the party can have the same trait or ability. Here's another catch. There are things in the campaign that profoundly affect those touched by wild magic. You won't know what they are until they occur, and these events could prove detrimental to your character's well-being, depending on the situation or circumstances. If you choose not to give your character the wild magic feat, your character will not be susceptible to these occurrences. So, super interesting, right? It gives you a couple of different things you can hook into. It helps the players come up with a character. It gives them an additional benefit that could be awesome. I'm going to read through some of these. So the abilities include things like you can detect magic as the spell at will. All of these are at will. Nope, one of them is once per day. But let me run through these. So you detect magic, Featherfall. You are never surprised is the third option. You can cast Bark Skin, self only. Oh, Featherfall was also self only. Animal Friendship, Animal Messenger, Telekinesis, but only on objects. That's a powerful spell, especially at will. Tree Shape, once per day. Disguise Self, at will. Read Magic, at will. Immune to cold or fire, you get to choose one. That's a huge benefit. Immune, not resistant, just flat out immune. And how cool is that? Like, you could play that up and how you found out about it, and I mean, it's almost like a superhero origin, right? It really changes the whole feeling of the world, and everybody else or most people out there in the world also have these abilities. Immune to lightning and can cast Shocking Grasp at will. Dimension Door once per day. Pass Without Trace, and Water Walk. self only. Dispel magic, freedom of movement, self only. Charm person, spider climb, knock, identify, jump, speak with animals, long strider, invisibility, self only, and insect plague. So you just get one of those and you can kind of tie that into your background. I could see how, maybe if you were young when this event happened, and maybe because the ability you got was read magic, you could read magic as a free ability at will. You went into become a mage, or maybe some type of spellcaster, right? Because you had that ability that would inform what the rest of your character would be like. But you could also have somebody who was a little bit older when this happened, and maybe they were a squire to somebody who did training to be a knight and eventually went on to become a paladin. But they, for some reason, can cast the knock spell, and how can that character make that useful? And what was there something about them that made them get the knock spell versus something else? Like come up with those sorts of reasons. And so uh, this sort of thing, and again, I think it was Perkins who did this, is really just a great idea because it gives your characters and your players that many more things to hook into. Wherever the origin of the ability comes from, what the ability is, how it interacts with their characters, and how the world interacts with the characters who have those abilities. There's so many questions that come out of that, and so many cool things that can happen. I've had in games in the past where if you were a mage, you had some sort of physical change to your body, anything from a birthmark to you look like a cat person. And it was just called a mage mark, and I've read about them in other you know fantasy settings and things like that, and I just thought it was a very cool idea, and I could absolutely see something like that even being combined in with this wild magic thing. Like, okay, if you're touched by this magic, and maybe it's tied into that chaos thing I was mentioning earlier from Warhammer, if you're touched by the chaos magic and you were alive on this day that there was, who knows, a huge intercontinental dust storm or something like that, or chaos storm that passed through, and you have gained the telekinesis on objects only at will ability, maybe that has had other effects on you and your personality, and maybe you look differently because of it. And it's, your mage mark is, you have an exposed brain, and then we could get into like this whole crazy like mutant animals gamma world sort of thing very, very easily when you start defining things like that. So just think about that when you're coming up with your world. Don't feel limited to stick it to just being, oh, there's elves, dwarves, and gnomes, and halflings and humans, and that's it. And magic is just really rare, and like all the typical stuff, all the stuff that's been done to death that is sort of the default setting that people use. If you want to have something weird, dragons actually rule all your countries. You want to, or illithid, or all the monsters are in charge, and humans and everybody else are chattel that are just used for whatever. Well, that changes the entire setup of the game. So think about things like that. Think about how you can change up character creation, how the characters interact with the world, what the world is like, how the world influences the characters, all that sort of stuff. That's what this whole episode is about. Think about that, because it's all within your control, and there are so many games on the shelves already, so many different role-playing games that are just really changing the narrative structure, and that's it. That's all you're really buying. Or it's changing the game mechanics, and all the descriptions are just, that's really the part that makes it look like what we think it looks like. And that's it. There you go. I hope that's useful to somebody. It's something like I said, years and years ago, I realized, and I was like, wow, I could do so much more than I'm doing. And so I wanted to bring it up now because there's so much that you can do just with descriptions and by changing a very few things about your world to make it so much more fun and interesting. Hope you enjoyed that. Let me know in the comments, and that's it for now. Stand by for adventure. We'll be back on Thursday.